This is Play-by-Playcast,
Is that faster than a Greyhound?
the podcast about play-by-play guys, for play-by-play guys, by, I'm told, a play-by-play guy.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Now here's the host of Play-by-Playcast, Tom Bodett. Wait, the Motel 6 guy?
We'll leave the light on for you.
No, Joel Godet.
Joe Godet.
Joel
Joel?
with an L.
Okay, here's your host, Joel Godet.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
There's a swing and a drive, deep right center, that ball carrying, tie game! Tie game! Koske has done it! Oh, baby! Deep drive, way back! Ball game over! Cubs win! Cubs win! Oh, baby, Chris Bryant!
Hey, hello. Welcome back in to the Play-by-Playcast, everybody. My name is Joel Godet, and this is the podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster. As always, interact with us on social media at PXPcast. You can email me, jgodett@bsu.edu. And hey, you can find us on Facebook as well. I think it's Joel PXP is my new professional page. Joel PXP, Joel Play-by-Play. That'll have a whole bunch of other stuff on there, but every Play-by-Playcast episode will be posted there as well, which you probably don't need to access because you're listening to the pod anyway, which means you've found it. So congratulations on that one, and ignore the last couple of seconds. If you get a second as well, please do rate and or review the podcast. It certainly helps, and we've gotten a couple over the last couple of weeks that have stopped and thrown some stars our way. Does a couple of things. Number one, lets people know that, people listen to the podcast. So if other people stumble across it, they see ratings, they go, oh, that's great, maybe I'll tune in. It helps the algorithms, for whatever that means. I don't know. It's just everybody says it on podcasts. So it helps people find the podcast a little bit more easily. And then, selfishly, it makes, it lets me know that people listen. And that's good because, that helps keep this thing going and keep this thing alive. And I know that there are some people out there, because I see the numbers, that listen to this podcast and have not yet rated and or reviewed it. So take a couple seconds, and if you get an opportunity and you enjoy the product and you enjoy the conversations that we've had, if you've gained anything of it, throw some stars our way. I would certainly appreciate it. I love how I did, podcasting has turned into a great fun outlet, but also has turned me into a panhandler at the same time. Anyway, so interact with us on social media. Please do rate and review the podcast as well. Really good response to last week's episode with Jake Zivin, our first guest from soccer. Talked some beautiful game with the voice of the Portland Timbers last week. If you've not gotten a chance to listen to Jake's words in our conversation, you can check that one out in our back archive. John Boog Shiambi from ESPN was the week before him. Awesome response to his appearance on the pod. Craig Ackerman from the Astros, Toby Rowland from Oklahoma, and Jim Barber from ESPN the last few before that. Our entire back catalog is, as always, free and available to you. And it's free. There are some podcasts that paywall that kind of stuff. I'm not going to do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I don't know if you'd pay for it. And number two, I don't know how. So all 78 previous episodes of Play-by-Playcast are available. If you want to scroll back through, if you're new to the podcast and you haven't had the opportunity to go look at some of the earlier episodes, there's some really good conversations and some really good names that I think you'd enjoy if you head back toward the beginning and take a listen. All right, on to today's episode. And it's Len Kasper from the Chicago Cubs. He's the television voice of the Chicago Cubs. And I actually had two conversations with Len for this episode. We spoke last week, and combination of Len had to go somewhere, and I was a couple minutes late calling him. We only spoke for about 20 minutes, and we touched on some stuff, and I wanted to delve into it further. So hopped on the phone again with Len this week, and we continued our conversation. You might be able to tell if you can find the seam. Good on you. But there's a seam in there. I think it flows pretty well together. A lot of different topics that we cover. And Len is a guy that did not take the traditional route that we talk about I kind of labeled it on the pod the quote-unquote traditional route to get to a big-time job or a major league job, and that would be, you go to a minor league city and you call a couple seasons, and then you work your way up to a bigger city and a bigger city and a bigger city, and then you get a major league job. He was in a major market on the talk radio side, working in Milwaukee and being involved with the Milwaukee Brewers in that regard as well, and of his own volition started to get involved with the Beloit Snappers minor league team up in Wisconsin, and got the experience of doing baseball on a more regular basis that way, and then was able to parlay that into more with Milwaukee, which then eventually led to more with Milwaukee, and then the Florida Marlins, and then the Chicago Cubs. I did not do justice to any of that, but Len will give you the full rundown of kind of how his early career unfolded, and what that path was like for him. What his mental state was like as he got to be around 30 years old and thought, hey, is this going to happen? Those real conversations in our own heads that a lot of us have in broadcasting. So we'll touch on kind of his rise through broadcasting in baseball. We'll talk about what it takes to be a Major League Baseball announcer, kind of his 2 cents on the best way to become a Major League Baseball announcer, what Major League teams and decision makers look for. We'll talk about what goes into really good Major League play-by-play, working with a partner. We'll talk about storytelling from his vantage point. We'll talk about the Cubs job in general and, being one of those jobs. And this is, and I say this on the pod, it's a day and age now where everybody's a national broadcaster because everyone anywhere can get any feed. But with the Cubs, truly, anywhere you're sitting, you can turn on your television and be subscribed to any normal cable package and get Cubs games on WGN. So kind of the idea of, hey, is he a national broadcaster, a local broadcaster, a mix of the two? He has a very definitive answer on that. That was interesting to hear. So we'll touch on that. Well, we'll touch on being the TV guy and not getting to do as much of your normal responsibility when you get into the postseason, but how that also opens some different doors to see the game and have a different professional vantage point when you get into the playoffs and the World Series. He's been a part of teams that have won the World Series a couple of times in his career. We touch on a ton of bases. We talk about voice and his being in a band throughout his life and career. A lot of different things, a really wide-ranging conversation, and a fun one that I'm glad to bring to you this week with Len Kasper, the television voice of the Chicago Cubs.
I was in a major league market in Milwaukee, working full-time at the flagship of the Brewers, and got to know a lot of people with the ball club, and they knew of my interest in doing play-by-play, and I think they understood and had an interest in me kind of being their top fill-in in case someone on radio or TV needed a day off. But I didn't have a lot of experience. I didn't have any experience, really. So one summer, I think it was 97-ish, I called Brett Dolan, who later worked for the Astros. He was working in Beloit, and at the time it was a Brewers affiliate. And I said, hey, would you be okay if we're interested in me coming down and doing a couple of innings and sitting in with you on a few free weekends? And he said, absolutely, that'd be great. And I owe Brett a lot to this day and give him a lot of credit, because not every broadcaster in his situation would necessarily be open to that. They might be a little territorial, but he was more than accommodating, and we became very good friends as a result. I didn't do very many games. I would drive to Beloit when, I had a free weekend, and, maybe to Appleton. I went to Lansing once just because I'm from Michigan. So it's just a very small handful of games that I did. But those innings allowed me to give the Brewers some tape and say, it's raw. I haven't done a lot, but I've done some. And that was kind of enough to push me over the hump and give them the confidence that if they threw me into the fire, that I wouldn't be terrible. And I'm very thankful that they did that. And in 1999, I did 20 or 25 games, and ended up doing that for the next 3 seasons, which really positioned me well to apply for major league jobs prior to 2002.
What was that tape? What did that tape sound like? I know I had read that you've listened in the past, and after 10 seconds you want to burn it. So what did that beginning tape sound like? What did you learn from that? And kind of at what point did you figure, like, all right, I'm not getting a ton of reps, but I think I've got a handle on this, so that when they say, hey, we want you to fill in and do some Brewer stuff, in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I know I can do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say my recollection of my baseball work was actually not bad. It's more of when I go back and listen to anything I did 20 years ago, I hear it through my current ears, which is really unfortunate and unfair. When you listen to yourself from even a year or two ago, it's going to sound different. It's going to sound not as advanced. It's going to sound, you haven't learned the mistakes yet, right? So it's really difficult for me to go back and listen. But I think baseball-wise, I think I was a quick study just because I had been such a big fan and had, sat in my bedroom playing tabletop baseball and doing play-by-play in my head, and had grown up listening to Ernie Harwell and Paul Carey on the Tiger games. And, I had a good feel for that. I wouldn't say I was really good at it when I started, but I don't think it was a fish out of water situation. Let's put it that way. And I'd been broadcasting for a long time, so in that regard, the transition wasn't that difficult. And I think they recognized that, they knew that I was a somewhat polished broadcaster for my age. And even though I hadn't done a lot of baseball, I had done enough and had been around it enough and shown my knowledge of it that they were willing to take a chance on me. Let's put it that way.
The first Brewers game you did, though, was on TV, right?
It was, yeah.
Had you done TV before then?
No.
What are you thinking when they're saying, hey, we like to try this totally new thing? And I mean, obviously, we all tell ourselves, like, hey, I got this. But where are you at in terms of, hey, can I do this, basically?
Well, a few years prior, I had done one ESPN2 event where I was like a sideline reporter for a charity softball game. Again, I wasn't very good at it. But it's interesting, the producer to that event on ESPN2 was Michael Weissman, the famous longtime network baseball producer, and he was great. He gave me some pointers. We kind of stayed in touch over the years, not too much, but if I would follow up with Michael or see him somewhere, he remembered that event. My research guy that day was Steve Horn, who is Joe Buck's right-hand man. Yeah. And Steve and I are still friends to this day. And so that was really, really interesting and fun. But that's it. That's the only TV I'd ever done prior to the first baseball game I did. And, I didn't look at the camera enough in the open. I mean, all that stuff. But I corrected it for game 2. Was I nervous? Of course I was nervous. But this was my first Major League Baseball game, so I jumped at it. Did I know I could do it? I thought I could. It's hard to remember exactly how I felt going in, but I was not going to let that opportunity pass me by. And, I wasn't terrible, and they let me do another one, so it seemed to go okay.
I had read in an interview you'd done online that you had felt it. I mean, how old were you at that point?
When I did my first Brewer game, I was 28.
Okay. So I think you had, in the quote that I found is when you were 31, and it was when the Marlins job, I think, opened, and you kind of thought that, hey, maybe my opportunity was passing me by, and then the Marlins job falls into place.
Right.
I think probably around that age, a lot of us go through a very similar thought in this business. What was your mindset like at that point? How did you battle through it? And then I know the Florida job kind of happened quickly for you. What happened to say, like, all right, the opportunity might be passing me by, and then bam, there's your moment and you seize it?
Well, it was very specific to that off season because I had interviewed and been a finalist for 2 jobs, and I think it was a kind of an overreaction to that process.
Okay.
And honestly, being a finalist and being that close to getting those 2 jobs probably said the opposite. That I was on the verge of getting a job, not that I wouldn't get one. But
as people keep wanting to interview me and not hire me, it's terrible.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The Brewer job opened, and I was pretty well positioned. And to this day, I talking to people there, they said that was an excruciating decision because they liked Darren Sutton a lot, and they liked me a lot because I was there. And I think they made the right call at the time, and to this day, I think they made the right call. But it was really close, and when I didn't get it, I immediately talked to Darren, said congratulations. I was really happy for him. I was really bummed I didn't get it. I mean, obviously I didn't hold it against him. It wasn't his fault. But I think when you don't get a job or you face whatever the word would be, adversity in the business, how you respond to that, matters a lot. And he and I became very good friends as a result of him getting the job. And he said, hey, you should apply for my job. And I said, wow. He said, yeah, totally. He gave me a lot of information. He was very instrumental in getting me on the radar for the Angels radio job. So I immediately became a finalist for that job and interviewed the whole deal. And they were hiring 2 broadcasters. And, I heard later that it came down to combinations that they had considered either Terry Smith and Rory Marcus, who got the jobs, or Gary Miller and me. So, I was that close to getting 2 jobs and came up a little short, knowing I was going to go into 2002 without really a fill-in job in Milwaukee because Darren wasn't going to miss games. Matt had gotten to the point of excursion where he was doing a lot of national games. Darren coming in as the new guy, wasn't going to miss games. So, then I thought, oh man, I'm not going to do any baseball next year. I think that was kind of the emotional reaction to the idea of, will I ever, was this my best chance to get a job? And, in the end, not getting those 2 jobs turned out to be okay. And I got the job of the 3 that probably was the best one for me. I ended up moving, which I think was a good experience, going into a totally foreign market to me. I'd never spent any time in Miami, and it ended up being a wonderful experience. And then I got the Cubs job. So if one of those other 2 jobs had worked out, I might not have gone on from there, and I would be very happy. But I wouldn't trade what happened for anything in the world. Let's put it that way.
What's the secret to being a major league broadcaster? And I mean, I just say that to go through the process, the number of times you've gone through it, to get hired by 3 different franchises. What is it that directors of broadcasting or fans or front offices or stations look for that says, I don't know, I don't even know if there's a constant. Maybe this is a silly question, but what is it that makes a major league broadcaster in a lot of decision makers' eyes?
I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. And if I did, I'd tell you. And that's the interesting, fascinating, frustrating part of this business, is that there are no absolutes. Every person who hires somebody has a different idea of what they want, what they like. I will break down the constants and the things that I believe in terms of applying for a job.
Sure.
I can give you those. Doesn't mean I'm right. But I think the number one mistake, I guess, a broadcaster makes with baseball demos is giving too many highlights and too much action. I think our sport is primarily not much happening over the course of a 3-hour time period, and your ability to make those moments interesting matter. I'm not saying don't put highlights and home run calls, but that's not the guts of the job. That's the, I'm using air quotes, the easy part of the job. We can all scream and get excited. The challenge and the hard part of this job is to do a 10-pitch at bat when there's no score in the bottom of the third inning. And that takes 4 minutes. That's where you separate yourself. And that's really hard to do. So I encourage when people apply, put your highlights on there, but put a couple of innings and don't overthink it. Don't edit it too much. When I applied for the Marlins job, I basically gave them 6 or 7 innings of one game. I just said, here's a game, and if you want a highlight call or a home run call, bottom of the fifth, whatever. There was a big double play in the whatever in the eighth, so I kind of pointed them to some bigger moments, but I said, here's just a game. And I think that you exude confidence when you don't overthink it. Baseball is also a sport of comfort. Most of your work should sound pretty consistent. So, if you're overthinking it and editing and mixing and matching too much, you're kind of taking the life out of what you do, and you should be comfortable with just giving them, here's me. Here's any game in the last 6 months. This is what I do. If you like my sound, then we're good to go. So that's number one. Number two, I also tell people recommendations matter, but not nearly as much as you think, and to be very, very cautious about how and when and who you use to make calls. And I've learned that through trial and error myself. I've learned it through being the person asked to call. There's a few rules that I keep in mind, and I try to tell young broadcasters. Number one, quantity does not overtake quality. There is a point where people don't want to hear 4 or 5 calls about the same person. The bottom line is you have to sell yourself. A very strategically placed phone call or email from someone you know really well and who knows you really well matters 10 times more than someone who has a name someone will recognize but doesn't know you that well. So the example would be, and Bob Costas is a friend of mine, but if a young broadcaster had met Bob Costas, maybe sent him his tape, talked to him for 10 minutes, and then asked him to be a reference for a job, he might agree out of being polite and call the person hiring and say, I heard from Joe Smith and I like his tape and he seems like a nice guy. That is as generic a recommendation as possible. Now, it comes from Bob Costas, who's one of the all-time greats, but it's way more powerful to hear from someone, the hiring person who's never heard from and doesn't know, who says, I hired Joe Smith when he was 22. He worked for me for 3 years, and here's exactly what I like about him and why you should hire him. A, B, C, D. And also here are the things that he wasn't good at and has improved. And here are a couple of things I still think he needs to get better at. I mean, someone who's going to give the full picture. That is empowering. That works, because then if you're interested in Joe Smith, you can ask a lot of very specific questions. And I think most people go the other direction. They want someone who has a name and someone who has a tangential relationship with you, or an acquaintance type relationship, as opposed to a fundamental relationship where you've worked with or for this person. Does that make sense?
100%.
Yeah. So, that to me matters, and I can give you examples of it. I don't need to, but I've utilized people I've been very close with who, didn't know the person hiring, and that had a huge impact. And I've also used people who have a huge name who maybe gave me a very generic recommendation because, why would they know? I've done that. I've done it where I've offered to give a recommendation, and it didn't feel like I could really give a great recommendation because I didn't know the person that well. And, I try to fight that a little bit and only give recommendations or phone calls for people that I know really, really well because, I want to make sure that I can be an effective reference as opposed to just someone who has a name somebody may recognize.
Can I take you down path number, or I guess part number one on that a little bit more as well? And
Sure.
Tell me more about the way that you call the quote unquote, boring part of the game when nothing happens. How do you make that interesting? And what's the way that you approach it to say, here's what I'm going to tackle? I've got a 3-hour beast, 2 hours and 45 minutes of it are going to be that lull. What's the best way to do that, particularly on television?
It's hard to explain. It really is. It's hard to write a textbook because every day is different. I used to be a creature of habit. I've really tried to not be that because we're on every single day, because it's 500-600 hours of broadcasting a summer. You've got a lot of time. I think number one is obvious. Don't use all of your information right off the bat. You don't have to give the bio of every player who comes to bat. If you have a 3 or 4 game series, Andrew McCutchen is probably going to have 16 plate appearances. You don't have to spill all of your information about him in the first plate appearance or the second. You've got time. You want to be on top of your team. I think, depending on your market and kind of your gauge of, what fans like and don't like about how much info you give on the other team. I think you can tend to overdo it on information on the team you're playing. It's a real tough balance sometimes. I think you just have to go with what interests you the most. You have to make decisions based on what you think is interesting. I don't generally sit there and think, what does this fan sitting at home think is interesting? I have to make decisions based on, if I like it, if I think it's interesting, I'm going to make it interesting. If I don't find it interesting, I'm going to have a hard time making the viewer find it interesting. So I do think that in that regard, you've got to trust your gut. That's number one. Number two is just not be in a hurry. I hear young broadcasters who do a lot of other sports. Their cadence is too fast for baseball. You've got a lot of time. It's having energy without rushing. And that's a skill you can only learn through experience. Trial and error. You do it, you listen to it, and you go, I didn't like that. I'm going to tweak it. You do it again. You go, ooh, that sounds pretty good. I like this, but I don't like that. So I'm going to tweak that. If you do it every day, those reps become just enormous. So you can make a long at bat. You can make a long boring inning. You can make a 12-3 blowout sound interesting just by knowing what avenues to go down with your partner. You get to know the person you're working with, what makes them tick, what makes them laugh. And I think the other thing is being present. You do your prep, you have all the information you've gathered before the game, and then you do everything you can to not bury your face and your brain into that information because it's already there at your disposal. But there are so many things and roads to go down during a game by just watching the field and seeing things, especially on television. Not only things in the stands, but what an umpire might do. There was a moment in a game recently where Daniel Murphy had a conversation with the second base umpire, I think during a pitching change, and it was clearly about positioning. And I was doing radio. It was the playoffs. And we came out of the break, and I was talking to Ron Coomer, and I pointed out, and Ron was an infielder. I said, Ron, I just noticed, Daniel Murphy had a lengthy chat with the second base umpire, and I recalled that Murphy had an issue with an umpire earlier this year, and we talked about shifting and how the game has changed in terms of where infielders play and how you ask an umpire, hey, could you move 2 feet to your right or to your left? And that ended up being a really interesting conversation just because I was paying attention to the field during a pitching change, right? So those little things seem obvious, but you'd be surprised when you get to the ballpark and you're sitting in the booth and you're just grinding on all the information you've gathered and you're not really seeing what's happening in front of you.
You talked about working with partners, and I'm curious just in terms of your experience, what it's like working with a partner in baseball, particularly on television. I've not done a lot of partner work with baseball. Most of what I've done has been solo. So if you can kind of touch on the uniqueness to doing a baseball broadcast with other people, and how to generate that conversation and create that conversation and sustain it over the course of 3 hours.
I think number one, just the basic difference between radio and television is pretty obvious to people who do it, but might not be so to people who don't. And the simplest way to put it is that baseball on the radio is a play-by-play venture, and baseball on television is more of an analyst's medium.
Sure.
And the obvious point is that you're not describing what is happening as much as why and how, and filling in the blanks and supplementing the pictures. So, there is play-by-play involved, obviously, but you're not required, nor should you call every pitch. If you have a partner who is making a pretty interesting point or telling a story, you would never want to interrupt that story to say there's a foul off of first. So it's more about knowing when not to talk on television, especially when you have an ex-ball player or an analyst who you really want to bring out a lot of those things. So for me, it's just giving space. That's the number one thing. Certainly, you're going to have questions and a few things that you have in mind for your partner throughout the broadcast, but for the most part, you're just trying to set up those moments and give blocks of space for them to jump in and to make their observations. And the other thing is just listening. When you work alone, you're driving the entire broadcast, and everything that's said comes out of your mouth. It's easy sometimes to forget when you're working with a partner that they may say something that spurs another question or another observation. You've got a million things to think about when you're calling a game. So, oftentimes you find yourself missing 3 seconds of what that person said, and now you're going, uh-oh, did he ask me a question? There's something I should follow up with. So you really need to concentrate and to pay attention. And I think listening to your partner and really keeping your focus on the field, those two things are paramount. In addition to all the other things you have to do, it takes a lot of focus, and it takes split focus. You really need to be locked in on all of those things. And then you have a producer and a director talking to you in your ear. And usually that happens when the other person is speaking. So there are a lot of things to juggle, but through experience, you learn how to, I guess, separate those things in your brain and make sure that you're paying proper attention to all of them.
How much partner prep do you do in terms of sitting down and going over, hey, this is what I've got, what do you got? How do we attack this? Where do we hit it? What are we going to hit? And how much of it is spontaneous to kind of get that first run reaction, if that makes sense?
Well, at this point, it's as little prior conversation as possible.
Okay.
The one thing that I have found, especially with really good analysts, and I've been blessed to have some great ones, is that their first reaction and the first conversation you have about an interesting topic is usually the best. And so if you have a chat before the game about a certain player or something that you want to talk about during the game, to then try to do that again on the air kind of takes the air out of the ball. So, my thing is, if I have really interesting things that I know Jim DeShays is going to jump on or laugh about or have fun with, that's the last thing I'm going to mention to him before the game. And I want him to do the same with me. I think we have a rhythm and a relationship now that, we know what makes the other guy tick. We know what makes that person interested. And I don't want to overplan at all. And I think the tendency in our business is to overplan and make sure that we've got all of our bases covered. But, every game is different. And I like the idea of springing something on my partner that he had not previously contemplated and getting his initial gut reaction. That's way better and more organic and a lot more fun. And we have, non-baseball conversations that occur in that manner that take on a life of their own. And that's to me the moment where you have something special.
This might be a hard one, and it can go in two directions. Has there ever been a situation where you've done that and it's not gone right? And has there been a situation where you've done that and it turned into something really fun and memorable?
Oh, absolutely. All the time. It's all trial and error. And the stuff that, quote, doesn't work, you just move on,
Okay.
And that's the beauty of it. And that's why you do it that way, in my opinion, is because you can't ever map out or script a game. That's number one. Number two, what allows those moments to be great is that certain ones aren't going to be. It's almost a given that has to happen. You can't have everything you do turn into gold. It's just not how life works. So, you try a few things here and there, and if during the course of a game you throw 3 or 4 things out there, and one of them turns into a really fun thing, that's great. And the things that, quote, don't work, it's not that they don't work, they just don't kind of go to maybe a place that you thought they would, or what have you. My mantra, and I think most broadcasters try this, and for the most part we're successful at it, but it's not always the case, is that you never want to say anything unless you feel like it's interesting. I hate just filling space just to do it. But there are those moments where you have to, right? The game isn't that interesting. There may not be a lot going on around baseball. There's just these dead moments in a game or in a season where you feel like you're a little bit at a loss. So those are the moments where you just kind of throw something out there that might grab on, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. It's just part of live television, and it's why I really enjoy it, is that not everything you try is going to work.
Do you do anything? Are there different ways that you can creatively fill some time and tell some stories as well? And I'm thinking things like Crosstown, where Benetti does Sox math, and having different ways to just change things up over the course of a broadcast. How do you approach stuff like that?
Absolutely. Again, my philosophy's changed over the years, just as you gain experience. To try to not over prepare or have too many things kind of in the hopper. My thing is just, I want to be able to know if I need some information that I can go find it quickly. In other words, I don't have to prepare a ton of things on a certain topic. I just have to know if that topic comes up, can I go to a certain place and find it? Whether that's, records, ballpark information, if JD brings up a former teammate of his or a guy he might have faced, I don't have to come armed with every batter pitcher matchup of his entire career, but Chili Davis is going to be our hitting coach. There may be a point where they faced each other, and that's a conversation that we have. I can quickly look that up, and it takes me 5 seconds to do it.
Sure.
I don't really need to do a lot of prep beforehand. And my guess is there's probably a story there where, hey, JD, you probably faced Chili Davis. How did you try to get him out? I don't need to bring that up to him off the air. On the air, I don't even need to look up if they faced each other. That's just a conversation that would be sitting there waiting for us over the course of a summer, where I just would ask, hey, did you ever face him? I don't need to look up and find out if he did. It would be more interesting to just kind of get his initial, I think we did, or absolutely I did. And, he took me deep twice, or no, he, by the time, I was doing this, he was, they did face each other because they were in the National League at the same time. But my point is that I don't need to really dig into those details before asking him that question, because that's not the interesting part of it. The interesting part is that he's going to have certain memories of who knows what about facing him, and that's way more important than, Chili Davis went 6 for 19 against you with 3 home runs, or I can find that out later. That's kind of the cap to the story more than anything else.
You have an interesting job in that anybody can watch a Cubs game anywhere in the country. And I guess that's more so the case across baseball now because, extra innings packages, et cetera. But on regular television, people can just tune in and catch a Cubs game. Is there something different about the fact that, you're a local broadcaster, but at the same time a national telecast?
When I took the job, I did wonder about that. The interesting thing about Cubs baseball, and for all the years WGN had been the superstation, I think it always was a local broadcast, and I think to try to change it into a national broadcast in any way would be a huge mistake. There's a Chicago thing that, if you're from here or if you're a Cub fan, you're in for life. And, other fans of other teams are still going to watch if they're interested in baseball or the Cubs or whatever. I never try to tailor it to a national audience. I'm doing a Cubs broadcast. I think that's the way Jack Brickhouse always did it. It's the way Harry Carey always did it. I think it's the way Chip Carey always did it. TBS went a different route before they dropped baseball. Braves baseball, I should say. They kind of tried to go to a national thing while they were still doing the Braves, and it was this hybrid. And, it didn't last very long. And I think that you have to stay true to what you know. And, I like the fact that there are Cub fans all over the world, not only around the country. But I never try to necessarily make it a less Cubs-centric broadcast because I know some other people may be listening or watching.
I think I'd read where you'd called it one of the best jobs, if not the best job in baseball, too, to be able to be a Cubs broadcaster. Is that part of it, that there are people worldwide that are able to tune in a little bit of a different fashion, or what else adds into that, other than that's where the paycheck's coming from?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think the Cubs have long been one of the most popular teams in baseball. They were called the lovable losers. That's no longer the moniker for obvious reasons, having won the World Series. But I think that always had a pull on people, that it's kind of an interesting narrative. Again, Harry Carey, I think, put the Cubs on the map and is still considered one of the most popular baseball broadcasters of all time. And then the thing we can never forget is Wrigley Field. I think the pull of that ballpark is really powerful. And you do have a lot of people who come to Wrigley Field who aren't Cub fans. They are just baseball fans. They want to come to one of the great landmarks in the city of Chicago. And, that part of it is enormous. And it's something that a lot of other franchises don't possess. So you add kind of all of that up, and the city of Chicago's, I think, unparalleled in terms of being a great sports town. I had a long-time national guy come up to me, someone I have amazing respect for, and he said, "You have my dream job." And I was floored by that. And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because the Cubs job, that's the job everybody wants." So, I'm very fortunate to be able to do it. And I think a lot of broadcasters look at this job as one of the best, if not the best, in the sport.
I want to ask you about the World Series, and you brought it up, and I think you were with the Marlins when they won as well, correct?
I was, yes.
What's it like when you do the TV for an entire season? And I know you slide over to the radio for a little bit during the playoffs, but to have one role and then you get to the games that really count, and you go into a different role and have a little bit of a different perspective.
Well, it's interesting. I'm very, very grateful to the Cubs and to the Score, and formerly CBS Radio, now Entercom Radio, but they have welcomed me in with open arms. And I've dabbled in radio the last several years, and basically, I told them I'm invested. I really want to be involved in any way I can. I don't want to step on any toes, but if I can be, of assistance to Pat and Ron in the postseason, almost as a quasi producer, it's just fun for me to be in the booth and to be a part of it because, as you said, local TV goes away once you get into October, and these are the games everybody wants to be around and to call. I've been able to call an inning of play-by-play. I do pregame interviews. And then when the Cubs, would win in the playoffs, I'm in the dugout or on the field doing a live interview right after the game. And that perspective is so different from what I'm used to.
It's almost better that way, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is fun. And, I end up becoming, because I'm not calling the entire game, I get way more nervous about the game itself because I'm kind of, spending my time kind of pacing around the booth. So that's been a lot of fun, and I really enjoy that. And, it would be hard not being involved in any way during the biggest month of any baseball season, which is the postseason. So, yeah, I'm very, very fortunate to have been a small part of it, and hopefully I'll have a lot more opportunities down the road. And, the Cubs are good, and hopefully we'll be back many more times.
Most broadcasters don't get that perspective, and many times I've thought about, gosh, I wish I could just have one game where I could sit in the dugout. What did you learn that maybe helps you do your job better, being able to see a game in that perspective?
Well, the game's a lot fast. Yeah, the game's a lot faster down on the field. Our perspective up in the booth, we can see everything and how it develops. You don't have that perspective when you're down on the field. When a ball is hit, you're not quite sure how far it's going to go. It's a lot more difficult for a base coach to figure out whether to send a runner or not when you're down at field level. I think you gain a really good understanding of how difficult a lot of those decisions are. And just to see the action on the pitches, from the side view of the dugout is really, really interesting. And just how the players are able to kind of slow down what is a really, really fast game.
Who hugged you first when they won?
Wow. That's a good question. I pretty much got hugs from everybody. The first guy I interviewed was Justin Grimm, so I'm sure at the end of the interview there was a hug. Dexter Fowler, I think, was in the mix. I'm sure David Ross. But yeah, pretty much the entire team at one point. And then Pat and Ron once I saw them in the clubhouse.
I know you've talked about Ernie Harwell a couple times while we've been talking, and I know he was one of your big inspirations when you wanted to get into this. What is it about him that attracted you? And I know he was kind of laid back and had that approach and had that style. And I don't know if it was that or what turned you on to Ernie Harwell and made you want to follow kind of in his footsteps, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Well, I think there are two parts. Number one, you grow up in a certain area and you have your team, and the broadcasters for that team obviously take on kind of a larger than life thing for you. But I was very lucky in that I had one of the best of all time to listen to every day in Ernie Harwell and his great partner, Paul Carey. Ernie was from Georgia, always had a little bit of a Southern drawl, but calling games in the upper Midwest, we always felt like he was one of ours. That's pretty powerful. He didn't sound like he was from Michigan, but he was a Michigander. He was the voice of the Tigers. I always loved that no matter what the score was, he always had the same tone. He was always happy to be at the ballpark and, very even keeled. And I feel like that matched my personality. There just was a cadence he had, a comfort level. If you listen to Ernie for, a couple of innings, I think without having heard him before, you would say that's a very comfortable listen. There was nothing that tried to make it about himself. There was nothing over the top about it. Everything was simple, to the point, and just right in the sweet spot of what I would want a baseball broadcast to sound like. And I was very fortunate to get to know Ernie later in his life and early in my career, and we became friends. And that's one thing about my career and my life that I'm incredibly grateful for is that I got to not only meet one of my heroes, but to become a good friend. And when I got the Marlins job, I got a handwritten note from Ernie. When I got the Cubs job, I got a personal phone call from him. And those are the moments that you really cherish. And it gives me goosebumps just to think about the fact that he took the time out of his day to think about someone who grew up listening to him and who had admired him, and to return that favor meant a lot to me.
How much better did you, I don't know if this is even the way to put it, but I mean, how much better do you become as a broadcaster once you're able to meet the guy that you idolized and kind of learn from him in the flesh, even if he doesn't realize he's doing it? What rubs off on you?
I think what rubs off the most is just to be yourself. And I think we naturally, when we all start, we have an idea of what a broadcast should sound like, and that usually comes from listening to someone like Ernie or Ben or Jack Buck or Harry Carey, and you tend to maybe mimic them in a certain way. And I don't think young broadcasters should run away from that at all. We all have to start somewhere. The broadcasters who are immediately find their own voice are usually the ones who just skyrocket to the top. Joe Davis would be an example.
Sure.
I got tapes from Joe when he was still in college, and I could tell right off the bat that he was a natural, and he was going to be a pretty quick study. But for the most of us, it's when you start, you tend to copy the style of someone you respect. So I think when you meet someone like Ernie, you get to know him. You find out that off the air, they're exactly like they are on the air. And it's a good lesson to all of us that, you have to be your own person. You have to be your own broadcaster. And over the course of time, I think being genuine and being yourself is the best way to go. And there's a moment in every broadcaster's career, just through sheer experience, where your own voice tends to come out. And that's when I think you're really able to lock in and kind of take your craft to another level.
I want to ask you a random question, if I may here, and I guess part of it is kind of who you are and finding, I guess, kind of finding literally your own voice. You sing in a rock band, correct?
I did about 20 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Now I basically play bass for a couple of charity events, but yes, I did at one point sing in a rock band. I was the singer by default. I will. I want to make sure that is known, that it wasn't that I really wanted to be the singer. It just was more or less that nobody else raised their hand.
Fair enough. Can you tell me about the development of your voice, though, and that as an instrument, quite literally as an instrument, but also in regards to what you do and kind of how you were able to craft your sound and kind of find your voice in terms of broadcasting as well? And I don't know if those two things go hand in hand, but it kind of hit a light bulb when I saw it.
Well, my singing voice is not very, very good, and I never really spent a lot of time figuring it out. I would say in terms of my broadcasting, I think a lot of broadcasters, spend a lot of time, making sure that they're hydrated, making sure that, they don't strain too much. I'm cognizant of all those things, but, I have found that my personality is such that the less I think about it, usually the better off I am. And I really try not to overthink those things. If I start to feel my voice get a little scratchy, I'll double up on the emergency and maybe the coldies, cough drops, or what have you. But I really try to not necessarily do anything specific with my voice. I just want to kind of live my life and try to do everything I do normally and adjust as I have to. I've had some throat issues in the past in terms of strep and some tonsillitis. And there was a point where it looked like I might have to get my tonsils out, which I really, really didn't want to have to do because I didn't want to mess with anything around my voice or my throat. Fortunately, that has stabilized. But I have friends who've had throat surgeries. Obviously, Joe Buck had one a few years ago. I think Tom Brenneman did recently. Dave O'Brien with the Red Sox told me that he had his tonsils or out or was going to at some point. So, it does happen, and it's scary when you hear about it. But I've been very fortunate, knock on wood, to this point where my voice is held up.
Have you ever done it? I mean, are you just you, or have you done it? Like, have you taken voice lessons or tried to do different techniques?
I have not.
Or is it just you are who you are?
I am who I am. Yeah, I have not. I do have friends in the business who have taken voice lessons and worked with, coaches on diction and projecting and all those things. But for the most part, no, it's just I am who I am, and what you hear and what you see is what you get.
I have one question I got when I put out that I was having you on the podcast. I asked if there were any questions for you, and I did get one that came in that I thought was interesting. And I don't know. I mean, baseball is a sport where we keep our own statistics for the most part in terms of keeping your own book. But it was if you have do you have any kind of talent stats help in the booth, or are there people in the truck that keep track of things that are beyond what you would just keep in your book? I don't know if it's charting pitch selection or fly ball, ground ball, or all that kind of stuff. What kind of production help comes along with a Major League Baseball broadcast?
Well, a lot of broadcasts, they have someone who is kind of their stats person in the booth. We don't with the Cubs. We never have. And we do have an associate producer in the truck who is responsible for graphics, and that person usually is tied in with Elias or Stats Inc. And are able to get certain stats that we request, or they may find interesting things that they will either pop up on the screen or tell me during an inning or during a break. That's the 19th first pitch strike out of the first 20 batters, stuff like that. So yeah, we do have a lot of assistance, and I think part of it too is just building a rapport with the people you work with. They also know the types of stats and the types of things that we find interesting, so they'll cater a lot of it to Len or JD will find this really cool, so I'm gonna research this a little bit. One kind of crowning achievement in terms of that teamwork, earlier in September, I had just been looking at Chris Bryant's baseball reference page, and I noticed his games played, and just a bell went off in my head. I thought, I wonder how many players in baseball history have played in 150 games in each of their first 3 major league seasons. And so I had our stats person ask Stats Inc., and we found out that once he hit game 150, which I think was 2 or 3 games before the end of the season, he was the first Chicago Cub ever to play in 150 games in his first 3 seasons, and only the 11th, I think, major league player all time. Now, that's a stat that we wouldn't have ever found, and probably nobody would have even considered. It just popped into my head that it was a fun question. And I actually told Chris before game 150, I said, I have a really cool stat, but I can't tell you for a couple of days. And we kind of had fun with it. And when I told him the stat, he lit up. He thought that was a really neat thing. And I talked to his dad about it a little bit later. And those are fun moments when you can give the player the stat and say, hey, by the way, you're the first Cub to do this. So those are the really fun moments for me. But for the most part, JD and I kind of have our own system in terms of what interests us. And I hate to overdo the stats and the graphics. You don't want to bludgeon people too much. So it's a little bit of a less is more philosophy. I think they're good tools to use, but you never want to get in the way of just enjoying a baseball game.
Len, last thing for me, this is more on the storyline side of things. What's working with Joe Maddon been like, and how has he changed maybe how you've seen baseball, or what have you been able to learn from him on a day-to-day basis?
He's the best manager I've been around in terms of knowing what we need to do. He'll give you any information you ask for. He likes second guessing. He likes to explain why he does what he does.
Interesting.
We can talk to him every single day, and I do as often as I can. And he gives it to us straight. Not all the information is necessarily stuff we can use on the air, but it gives us a good perspective on why things occur. And so if something comes up later in a ball game, whether it's, the closer not being available that day or whatever, we're armed with that information should the need arise to use it. So he totally respects what we do and is more than happy to explain any sort of moves or strategy. I have learned so much baseball. And the other thing from my perspective that's great is Joe's open to hearing new ideas and the conversations and crazy questions. I have a lot of weird strategic questions. Would you ever consider this? And he'll give me a straight answer. Sometimes it's, yeah, that's a really good point. Sometimes it's, nope, I never would, and here's why. And for someone like me who likes to learn something about the game every day, it's just, he's a gold mine of information.
You've never told him something that you thought was interesting and then had it pop up in a game and been like, wow, I told him that, have you?
Not necessarily, but we did have a conversation about sac fly attempts with one out, that I had read a stat that Pete Palmer had mentioned that teams don't try to score often enough on one out sac fly attempts, that the success rate is actually too high. And the theory is, even if you get thrown out on a sac fly attempt with one out to end an inning, as long as the percentage of that runner scoring is higher than the idea of the next batter with two outs getting that runner in for third, you should try it. And, Joe and I had a really interesting conversation about that. And, whether that led him to telling his third base coach to be more aggressive or not, I don't know. But it's a conversation we've had, and it's one that not every manager would necessarily be open to having if it's not an idea he came up with. So that I appreciate about Joe, that I can just say, hey, this was interesting. I found this here. Take a look at it. And he's like, yeah, that is interesting. Thank you.
Hey, that's Len Kasper joining us here on Play-by-Playcast. Hey, if you get an opportunity, let Len know that you listened and that you caught some parts of this episode, took something from this episode. It's one thing when I have these folks on the podcast and can say to them, hey, thanks, I appreciate it, and we appreciate it. But it's a totally different thing when Len hears that you heard him on the podcast and gained something from it. How do we all feel when somebody says, like, hey, like that thing you told me, it was really helpful. So if you can hit Len up on Twitter, he is at Len Kasper. Just let him know if you enjoyed the podcast today. Hey, this was really awesome. I really liked this. I really liked that. I thought your vantage point of seeing the World Series from the dugout and being on the field in the immediate aftermath, I thought that was really cool. I thought your stories of, searching for information and trying to tell stories and trying to find new and unique stories on guys and, stuff about Chris Bryant and his place in Chicago Cubs history. I thought that was cool. Whatever piqued your interest, tips on how to make it to being a major league broadcaster, whatever it was that you took away from this, give Len a shout and let him know again, at Len Kasper on Twitter. Really good guests coming up over the next couple of weeks, so I'm stoked for it here as we close out 2017, our first full year of Play-by-Playcast. I mean, we've been on for more than a year. Like, I can do the math there. We're almost at 80 episodes. But the first year, January 1 through December 30 days, have September. How many? 31. 31 in December. From January 1 to December 31, our first full year of PXP Cast being around. We'll close it out with Mike Breen next week, the television voice of the New York Knicks and, of the NBA Finals. It's a fun one. Tape that one this week with Mike Breen, so we'll drop that one for you on Friday of next week. Brian Estridge is the voice of the TCU Horned Frogs. He will be with us before year's end. Rich Burke as well from Pac-12 Networks will carry us through the end of 2017 and into 2018. As always, thanks to you for hitting subscribe and download. Appreciate your listenership, and we're off for a week. We'll talk to you next week right back here on PXP Cast. See ya.
And that will do it from St. Louis, where the score is inconclusive.